This is the last lecture for week number 6, adapting foods to people and people to foods. Now, you've read the chapters in the book, hopefully, so you know what this is about, and we've touched on aspects of this already throughout the term so far. And because I already gave you a different example in the previous lecture, food, ideology, symbolism, and power, with this particular lecture, I'm going to just touch on some of the basic aspects of a few of those chapters and really challenge you to critically assess those chapters in our book. And the first chapter that I just want to briefly skim is the Bitter Cassava and Nutrition chapter by Darna Dufour. Now, I'm partly doing this because this is really fascinating. A food item, a staple that is toxic, and the amount of work that it takes to detoxify that. So this is an example of adapting foods to people. Also, because I studied under Darna Dufour, and I partly think that she would kill me if I didn't talk about her chapter. We've already talked about cassava. We talked about this in terms of manioc. It's a crop staple. It is a dietary staple of people around the world, including right here in the Americas, in South America, where it was domesticated. And we've already talked about Darna. You know that she's worked with the Tucanoan peoples in the Amazon, and she studied, among many other things, cassava. Cassava is one of those plants that is ecologically flexible. It is adapted. It is adaptable, and it can survive in fairly acidic soils. It is drought tolerant. It is tolerant to heavy rains and flooding, and because of this adaptability, cassava is grown throughout the world. And I've got a chart up there on the screen, and you can see the 20 countries that produce the most cassava. But what makes cassava so fascinating from a nutritional and an anthropologic perspective is, like many other plants, cassava contains toxins, and a particularly nasty toxin, cyanide. Cassava is ingested. People eat cassava for its roots and leaves, but the roots, the leaves, and the pills all contain cyanide and simply cannot be eaten raw. The amount of cyanide in cassava it varies from one variety to the next. And the two basic types are often referred to as sweet cassava, which has less and sometimes significantly less cyanide, and bitter cassava, which tends to have more cyanide. The sweet cassava for the Tucanoan natives can be simply peeled and boiled, and that helps to reduce the cyanide, and then eaten. But it does contain cyanide. It has only about 100 milligrams per kilogram of the plant, or less than 100 milligrams. But the bitter cassava has over 100 milligrams, and some varieties can have a lot more, up to 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. And it just so happens that cassava grown in more acidic soils or in drier conditions also tends to have more cyanide. Cyanide, as you know, is a poison. We're talking about, in the sweet varieties, having up to 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. In the bitter varieties, up to 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. Well, just 2.5 milligrams will kill a mouse. Now, believe it or not, there are reports on human deaths due to exposure to cyanide in terms of toxology. And the lethal dose for humans is about 450 milligrams total, although some people have died with only about 150 milligrams of cyanide. So this is a dangerous food, or it can be an incredibly dangerous food. And the average amounts of cyanide in the cassava varieties that are eaten by these peoples is 454 milligrams in a plant. Now that is a lot. Now 454 milligrams is not what the Tucanoans ingest. That would be a lethal dose. You've seen that chart, and there's several tables and charts in that chapter that show you this intensive process that these peoples need to go through in order to detoxify a cassava plant, and going from a root that has, say, 454 milligrams, and that would be 100% of all the cyanide in that, and then bringing that down to only, say, 17 milligrams or 3% of the original amount of cyanide in there. It's a really amazing process, and I want you to be familiar with that. And particularly, I want you to know the importance of each of these steps, and that simply heating cassava does not significantly reduce cyanide in bitter varieties, and more importantly, that there is minimal loss of nutrients due to the way this is processed, and there is minimal actual cyanide ingested each day because of the process. Now, if you are interested, I would encourage you to go to one of our local grocery stores and buy some cassava. Now, you can do this. You can buy cassava in terms of cassava chips in several of our grocery stores. And the last chapter that I'm going to preview and review in this lecture is the Milk for Fitness chapter, which I may not do this in just a few slides. I might take a few more because it's a really interesting chapter. How many times have you seen an ad for drink milk? And this may be commercials or advertisements in a newspaper or a magazine or on a billboard. There was one point where these were everywhere. And you might not have thought about milk products as sort of odd before, and maybe you have. But we talked about this briefly already, all the way back in weeks number 2 and 3, when we looked at the food pyramid. The idea that milk does the body good, right? That's what the ads say here in this country. Milk or dairy products are even part of our food pyramid, that you should be getting a certain number of servings, 3, whatever that is, right? But why milk or dairy products? Because, as it just so happens, not everyone can even digest dairy products. Your body produces a protein, lactase, and that protein can break down the sugar that you find in milk, lactose. That is a disaccharide, and hopefully you remember what a disaccharide is. And this particular one is composed of glucose, right, that's always there, and galactose. Now, you cannot absorb lactose directly. You need lactase to break that down so you can absorb the sugar. As it turns out, in most populations, lactase activity reduces with age of an individual. As you age, your body is not able to digest dairy, milk, or other dairy products as efficiently. And we find that in mammals in general. We are, after all, a mammal, and we are a primate. Now, we need that milk like other mammals at a certain age or stage of growth and development. And because most mammals and most primates and many humans do not drink milk as an adult regularly, at least after being weaned from surviving on milk as an infant, the production of lactase to digest lactose naturally declines. So by adulthood, it's very difficult to digest, or can be more difficult to digest, dairy products. Now, we used to call this lactose intolerance, but we no longer call it that. And I want you to be able to comment on the difference between lactose intolerance and lactase persistence, or lactose intolerance, tolerance, and lactase persistence, impersistence. Now think about this. I mean, this whole chapter is excellent and will make you think. But why do we call it lactose tolerance or intolerance? That seems to imply that there is something wrong with an individual. They are intolerant of something. So we don't use that terminology anymore. We call this lactase persistence. And there are, of course, genetic and environmental components to lactase persistence. So we find this lactase persistence more frequently in certain populations around the world. And part of that is related to a reliance on certain animal domesticates. Now, in all populations, you're going to find individuals that are able to digest dairy products, lactase persistence. And in all populations, you're going to find individuals that are not as efficient at digesting dairy products, so lactase impersistence. Regardless of what you find at that population level. And what that boils down to is a great question. Why? Why drink milk? Or why ingest anything dairy? Especially because the typical human condition is lactase impersistence. Except, of course, those populations that have or currently do rely on dairy products. And you can answer the question, why drink milk, from a nutritional perspective. I mean, you can relate this to kilocalories, to macronutrients, to micronutrients, which we didn't get into, but one of those important ones, calcium. And you can relate all of these to healthy bodies, bone and muscle, fetal and adolescent growth, osteoporosis. So we know that milk is good. But this is interesting. Obviously, what we are talking about here is a case of people that are certain people that are adapted to foods. Now, not all people. And in the U.S., the milk farming tradition and adaptation came from Europe. Peoples from Europe settled in the New World. They brought livestock. They brought their way of life, including the food system. Well, in America today, there is a diversity of people. But milk is still the thing that does the body good. And dairy products are still recommended. So that goes back to that first question on the screen. Why? And I am not going to get into all the details with that because you have read the chapter and you can answer that question. Now, you know that the USDA is charged with fairly conflicting goals here. They need to support agricultural interests and need to provide nutrition and health guidelines. So the USDA supports and influences a number of institutions, clinical, public health, food assistance programs, which all often adopt USDA policy and approaches. And the book goes into this. The solution in each of these institutions and with the USDA, as you read, even refers to a study that supports their claim that you need to drink milk. The solution is drink more milk. Medical institutions also tend to default to this solution, that the solution is to drink milk or to ingest dairy. And they view lactase impersistence from this lactose intolerance perspective. In other words, that it's a disorder or an abnormality that can be cured. So the solution is still there. Dairy is still the solution. You just need to cure the problem with ingestion. And as the book goes into, anti-milk organizations also tend to view lactase impersistence from this lactose intolerance perspective, that it's some sort of a negative physiological consequence. However, the solution there is not drink milk or ingest dairy, right? And the subtext behind a lot of this is politics, power, and control. Now think about this. The USDA, as you read about, as we talked about on the previous slide, charged with conflicting interests, supporting agriculture and providing nutrition and health guidelines. Dairy makes up more than 11% of U.S. agricultural commodities. So the USDA isn't providing support to a very small portion of agriculture, but to a very significant portion that generates a lot of revenue. So the debate is not as simple as healthy versus non-healthy as it might seem, but power and control. Because as it turns out, a lot of Americans, a lot of people, are lactase impersistent. And yet all of those dairy nutritional guidelines apply to everybody, apply to all Americans, right? The justification is often that there is a calcium crisis. And the USDA has argued that there is a decline in milk consumption, and along with that there is a decline in calcium intake. Now that is, first of all, also not accurate. But the solution doesn't have to be to ingest more dairy products or to drink more milk. The solution simply needs to be eat more foods that are rich in calcium. And you can get calcium from other products like vegetables, nuts, legumes, even fish bones. And you may pick out some of the bones when you eat fish, or maybe you don't. But fish bones are a great source, and many people do eat fish bones when they eat fish. So there are other foods out there, and there are other populations that have a sufficient intake of calcium despite their intake of milk being lower than RDA values. But you don't hear that, right? You hear drink milk. Milk equals health. Milk equals fitness. So milk actually is a really interesting and a great example of not just people adapted to foods, but the complexity involved in that in terms of ideology, in terms of power, in terms of cultural layers and the fabric of culture, control, manipulation of data, in the sense that certain data is ignored, like lactase impersistence is real, which hopefully you read that and got that out of the chapter, or that certain data is just justified away, like the studies that look at lactase impersistence as problematic because it results in reduced milk consumption, not because of the physiological problems that it can cause. And I knew I was going to end up talking longer than I thought on this lecture. So thank you for listening, and we'll stop there for this week. Again, just a preview for the week's material. This week we have the 2 lectures and all of those chapters, or the articles, the chapters in our book on ideology, symbolism, and social power of foodways, and adapting food to people and adapting people to foods. The readings, you have also some current news articles. There's no graded assignment this week. That's good news for a lot of you. Woohoo! But take advantage of it. Keep making progress on your final project. And if you want, go ahead and turn in your second progress paper early. That will save you the headache next week, because next week we have more readings in our book and with current news articles. We have lectures focusing on food as medicine and undernutrition. I might do a documentary, but I might scratch it because we've already done quite a lot. And next week you'll have to turn in your second progress paper, and we have a quiz, our third quiz. So might as well take advantage of this week and get that second progress paper done. Okay, we'll see you next week.